and I'm not going to stand because it's been a long day. I want to firstly congratulate Gillard and team for the research, and I know that you've put up with a lot of frustration and very short time periods, so I do encourage you all to go home and read it until 3 o'clock in the morning. But also, Stephanie, thank you. And some of what you shared with us, we heard today at NMW, but I think that the kinds of international lessons are really encouraging when you think that there is no sort of victory or future sort of steps that you've attained. I'm going to just throw out some ideas because this is really now about you guys. It's not about the rest of us sitting in these very uncomfortable chairs. I think one of the main take-home messages, Stephanie, from what you were saying, was the question of the creation of new alliances. I mean, we know that something as radical as a meaningful minimum wage is going to need political support. So for me, one of the questions is, with the emergence of some of the student movements, sort of anti-outsourcing organizations, who are the critical allies that we need to have involved in this discussion, and how do you build that, including sort of faith-based organizations. And we've seen quite a demise within the left sort of over the last 10, 15 years. The rise of the Tina, sort of neoliberal, there is an alternative approach. So I think possibly in the last 8, 12 months, we've seen newly emerged organizations and battles. So how do we bring those in to bear in terms of addressing the more conservative elements that are opposed to the question of a national minimum wage? Another issue for me is that question of wage policy. When the Deputy President announced at the in the Ekululeni Declaration on the 4th of November 2014 that we would be engaging on talking around the national minimum wage and modalities for introduction, there was also a strong shift from business and community that we needed to have a progressive transformation of the wage policy per se. If you look at the 2010 OECD report into inequality in South Africa, undertaken by Saldra at UCT, for me, one of the interesting things was looking at inequalities in income inequalities in South Africa. One of a greater driver was wage inequality than unemployment was. So it was the gap between highest and lowest wages, rather than the gap between employed and unemployed, that set the tone for income inequality in South Africa. So with the debate around a national minimum wage, I would also challenge comrades and audience to say, how do we advance a much more substantive shift in terms of thinking about wage policy? One of the things that I had sort of the benefit of talking to Stephanie about earlier was the question, and it's not just semantics, but the distinction between a living wage and a minimum wage. So a minimum wage being the floor below which no one should fall, but a living wage actually being the wage which would address the basic needs of workers and their families. In South Africa, we've tended to see poverty as being very absolute. So basically, as the former Deputy President Kgalema said, that which you need in order to live and not die. Now, in a constitutional democracy such as ours, which has a history of liberation movements, I mean, is that sufficient for us to aim at, or what should we be aiming at? What would be the kinds of setting of a decent standard of living, which could then be translated into wage policy? Which leads me, no one's taking notes, you've got to give me answers. Which leads me to my next question, which is, where people are unemployed and therefore will not benefit from the full national minimum wage, what are the alternative mechanisms that can ensure distribution of income to them sufficient to meet their basic needs? So if we consider, for instance, comprehensive social security, I mean, many of you will be aware that for working age people between the ages of 18 and 59, there is no access to a social grant. So you might be unemployed, you might be poor, but the only way that you can access fiscally funded social assistance is through your child, through someone in your household receiving a state or age pension or a disability grant. So we need to address, in order to have greater equity, we need to address the needs of workers, but we also need to address the needs of the under and unemployed in South Africa. What are the ways that we can do that? I think something which Stephanie's raised a couple of times is that of messaging. If we want the majority of South Africa to be engaged in this debate, what are the different messages that we give to different sectors? I mean, there's the scaremongering about the fact that we could have a violent revolution tomorrow. There's the question of greater productivity. And that's possibly not something which we can answer or should answer tonight. I'll go for the 10 minutes. But it's really about saying, how do we, in our different spaces, engage? And what's the best message around that? I think the question of, part of that is also the question of rights versus affordability. I mean, in South Africa, we have, we've got justiciable socio-economic rights. We last year signed the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which introduces the right to work, which is not in our constitution. By work, do we mean work at any pay, or do we mean decent work, such as we've agreed to sign up for with the ILO? So, which approach is it that we have? And are we prepared to litigate around the level of a meaningful national minimum wage? And then I think just in conclusion, 2 further points. We've also got to look at the changing nature of employment. So for many people who graduate from Wits University, you're going to end up sitting with Mac computers like that one in coffee shops, not contributing to a pension, not contributing to Social Security, and also not being unionized. I hate to say that, because our representatives say that. But the question is, how do we then start looking at new forms of protection which are appropriate to the changing face of work? And then, if we are wanting to look at campaigning around this, what are the different roles and sort of participatory measures that we can have, especially for people directly affected by poverty? So if you're wanting people to join a campaign, what is it that we want them to do? Are we asking them to organize and meet with local government? Are we asking them to meet with their employers? Instead of having a top-down campaign, how do we build a bottom-up campaign which we possibly as research agents don't necessarily devise but can support? So thank you very much, and let's hope that we get answers.